All truck drivers must know this code. Without exception, everyone must know it. Before we begin, tell me which highway or road you are most afraid to drive on. And so I begin my speech by saying that the air was not cold. It was a physical, solid weight, a glacial pressure that cracked the windshield of the truck even before the engine died. And when the massive diesel power finally choked and sputtered its last breath, vanishing into the oppressive silence, the cold rushed in to fill the vacuum. It seized my lungs, freezing the wet membranes instantly, tightening around my chest like a vice wrapped in razor wire. I was 20 miles past the last sign of civilization, buried in the gut of the northern Yukon, where the black spruce stands shoulder to shoulder, thick and silent, stretching into a darkness so profound it felt less like an absence of light and more like a crushing, heavy liquid.
The stars above were vicious pinpricks, countless and indifferent, illuminating nothing but the endless white of the frozen highway and the spectral breath puffing from my mouth. The stench hit me before the true fear did. It was an impossible smell in that environment, contradicting the cleansing purity of the -40-degree air. It was a sickeningly sweet odor, coppery and primal, the unmistakable scent of a fresh kill, mixed with the sour, metallic tang of decay that had been accelerated by an unnatural heat. I gripped the steering wheel, my fingers stiff and numb, trying to cycle the ignition again, but the battery was utterly drained. The dashboard lights, my last warm beacon, flickered once, throwing agonizingly brief shadows across the cab, and then surrendered to the night. That was the first mistake, the fundamental, soul-crushing violation of the code. Every lone hauler who dared venture onto these tertiary logging roads knew it. Rule number 1, never lose your power source.
Never let the machine die. Without the engine's vibration, the world became soundless. The silence was not peaceful. It was a hungry, vibrating thing, a vacuum waiting to suck the warmth and the sanity right out of you. I could hear the microscopic clicks of the cooling metal of the truck's hood, the frantic thump of my own heart against my ribs, and the slick, wet sound of my own panic sweating into my thermal layers. It was the sight of the kill that confirmed the supernatural nausea bubbling in my stomach. I needed to check the fuel lines to try to restart the auxiliary generator. My flashlight beam, thin and weak against the vast dark, carved a path through the snow beside the driver's side door. That's when I saw it, about 10 feet from the truck's cabin. It was a moose, or what was left of one. The sheer size of the carcass was jarring, a massive shadow slumped against a snowdrift.
But it wasn't the blood that made me gag. I'd seen plenty of roadkills and hunting mishaps. It was the impossible way the creature had been opened. The hide wasn't torn or punctured by teeth. It had been peeled, carefully, almost surgically, stripped back from the massive ribs as if it were the skin of an orange. The muscle beneath was exposed, glistening wetly in the sub-zero temperature, somehow still unfrozen. And the bones, the long, heavy femurs and ribs, had not been chewed through, but neatly, deliberately, snapped at the joints, broken apart, and scattered in a neat semicircle around the torso. And then I saw the head. It hadn't been decapitated. It had been twisted. The neck was still attached, but the entire skull was rotated 180 degrees, facing backward, staring with opaque, frozen eyes toward the deep, impenetrable woods behind the truck. But the real horror wasn't the broken neck. It was the face. The soft parts of the face, the lips, the eyelids, the tender tissues around the jaw. They had been meticulously scraped away, licked clean. I stumbled back, my boots crunching unnaturally loud on the packed snow. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something that should not be eating in this manner, in this cold, or at all. This wasn't a wolf kill. Wolves tear, bears maul. This was surgical, almost ritualistic, and infused with a malice that transcended mere predation. This was hunger defined by intellectual cruelty. My mind, still grasping for rational anchors, whispered cougar, but the tracks I saw leading away from the carcass crushed that weak suggestion. I swept the flashlight over the snow again, following the disturbed path. The tracks were bipedal, 2 perfect indentations, long and disproportionately narrow, sinking deeply into the hard crust.
They were too large for any man, even one wearing the heaviest insulated gear, and the stride between them was wrong, an impossibly wide gap, suggesting a creature that stood easily 7 or 8 feet tall, capable of covering 10 feet with a single, silent step. And they were leading toward the front of my truck. My breath hitched. I hadn't come here looking for the code. I had just been trying to shave 6 hours off my delivery route through the less traveled Yukon corridor. But now, in the chilling, absolute silence, the old hushed warnings from the long-haul truckers and the indigenous elders echoed in my frozen skull. The Wendigo, the whispered nightmare of the north. The fear of a mechanical failure had been replaced by a terror far colder, far sharper. I was trapped inside a cold metal box, miles from help, and I had unknowingly parked beside the fresh kill of a thing known only for its insatiable, desperate hunger for human flesh.
I fumbled for the driver's side door handle, the cheap metal biting into my bare palm. I hadn't even thought to put my gloves back on. I scrambled back inside the cab, slamming the door shut. It was a futile gesture, I knew. That thin sheet of aluminum and glass would barely slow down a dedicated bear, let alone whatever had done that to the moose. But the illusion of barrier was essential. I yanked my heavy blanket from the bunk behind the seats and wrapped it around myself, shivering violently. I pulled out my satellite phone, the small screen glowing mockingly in the dark. No signal. Of course. We were in the dead zone, the deep, silent trough between relay towers. I was alone, stalled, and surrounded by the tangible residue of profound violence. I had reached the point of no return. The only way out was forward, but forward was impossible. The only path left was backward, into the suffocating abyss of ancient myth and desperation.
In the faint, diffuse light filtering through the thick spruce, I saw movement, not a sudden lunge, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the blackness. A section of the forest canopy, perhaps 50 yards away, seemed to absorb the light, drawing it in. I stared, my eyes burning, trying to resolve the shape out of the chaotic shadows of the spruces. It wasn't the sound that announced its presence, or even a clear outline. It was the feeling, a pervasive psychic cold that plunged below the level of temperature and settled directly into my marrow. It felt like being watched by something that didn't just want to kill me, but wanted to consume every fiber of my existence, reducing me to nothing but a momentary easing of its eternal famine. Then the sound came. It was soft, a scrape like fingernails dragging across frozen earth. Slow and hesitant, I pressed myself against the door, holding my breath.
The sound was closer now, barely a whisper carried on the wind, a dry, brittle, clicking sound. It sounded like cracked, fragile bone tapping against bark. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It had been watching me since I stopped. It had been waiting patiently for the truck's residual heat to bleed away, for my fear to crystallize, for the perfect moment to approach the cage. Then the scent intensified. That sweet, rotten decay was overwhelming, now mixed with something acrid and metallic, smell of ozone perhaps, or highly stressed animal musk. I peered through the condensation on the passenger side window, straining to find the source of the clicking. Massive spruce trees offered perfect cover, merging their silhouettes into an unbroken wall of black. And then I saw the eye. It wasn't reflecting light, it was generating it. A single, dull, sickly yellow pinprick, glowing deep within the darkness, placed impossibly high above the ground.
It was fixed on my window, unblinking, unmoving, radiating a concentrated, terrifying intelligence. The clicking stopped. The silence returned, more absolute than before, as if the entire forest was holding its collective breath, anticipating the final, decisive move. My survival manual, the one I had scoffed at as mere folklore until 30 minutes ago, flashed through my mind. The Yukon Code. 3 rules developed through generations of desperate survival, passed down in hushed tones over crackling shortwave radios. I was already in violation of Rule 1, keep the power. I needed to remember Rule 2, and fast, because the thing staring through the trees was no longer a myth. It was a famine, incarnate and patient, and it was waiting for me to make my second fatal mistake. My gaze dropped from the sickening yellow eye to the dashboard, where the frozen odometer read 147,902 miles.
I wondered how many other souls had reached their final destination right here, in this exact frozen stretch of nothingness, because they had failed to heed the old laws. The code was my only hope, but to enact it, I had to understand what it meant to face the Wendigo. I had to face the code, not just the temperature outside, but the profound spiritual code that radiated from that single terrible eye. I reached slowly under the seat, my hand shaking violently, groping for the rusted steel pipe I kept for emergencies. I was going to need more than a pipe.
I was going to need faith in the absurd, desperate belief that following 3 simple, impossible rules could somehow circumvent the primal, ancient horror, waiting patiently in the trees. The yellow eye blinked, slowly, deliberately, and something, a sound that was half rasp, half mimicry of a forgotten human sob, drifted across the frozen highway. It sounded like my own name, uttered by a throat that had forgotten how to breathe.
My breath hitched. My heart hammered. I had to remember Rule 2. It was the only thing standing between me and being peeled like that poor broken moose. I had to remember Rule 2 before it decided to move closer. The silence was not a vacuum. It was pressurized dome, thick and heavy, designed to crush the skull inward. Every breath I took, shallow and quick, sounded like a roar in the cabin. The heater fought a losing battle against the Arctic night, spitting tepid air that evaporated instantly upon hitting the interior of the windshield, leaving a thin, brittle layer of internal frost, a cold that seemed to originate from the inside, not the outside. I had been driving for 17 straight hours, chewing on dried jerky that tasted like leather and regret, trying to outrun the gnawing anxiety that had taken root somewhere around mile 150 of the Dempster Highway. I knew the rules, the code, but knowing them and following them, when the wilderness itself seems to be actively plotting your demise, were 2 very different things. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that should generate that particular scent cloud. I remembered the cautionary tale Manchuk, the old Cree mechanic, had told me. The one about the code being built on observation, not reaction. The Wendigo doesn't need to be fast. He'd rasped, his voice like dry leaves. It just needs you to be alone long enough to break your own mind. And then I heard it. It was a sound that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up and prickle beneath the thick wool of my jacket. A sensation of dread so immediate and total that it felt like a gold fluid replacing the blood in my veins. Click, click. It wasn't external. It was coming from inside the truck. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned ivory white, my eyes darting frantically across the dashboard, the floor, the sleeping bunk behind me. The sound was faint, rhythmic, and impossibly high-pitched, like a tiny fingernail tapping lightly on glass, or perhaps on bone.
Click, click, click. My breathing hitched. I realized the sound was emanating not from the cabin, but from the cargo hold. I was hauling a shipment of pressurized medical supplies, securely fastened and sealed tight. There was no way anything organic or alive could be back there. I pulled the truck over, tires crunching slightly on the compacted ice shoulder. I turned off the engine. The resulting silence was deafening, a physical pressure against my eardrums. I reached for the heavy-duty mag light under the seat, its aluminum casing cold and reassuring in my sweaty palm. The silence lasted for maybe 20 seconds. Then the sound began again, louder this time, metallic and scraping. Grrr, rape. Click. I stepped out into the air. It hit me like a physical blow, a dry, paralyzing cold that stole the moisture from my sinuses instantly. The smell of bone and winter decay was intense out here, swirling around the cab.
I shone the maglite across the length of the trailer, looking for anything. A broken lock, a snapped seal, a stray animal. Nothing. The trailer looked intact, a fortress of cold steel. I walked slowly towards the rear, the crunch of my boots agonizingly loud. As I approached the locking bar, I pressed my ear against the frigid metal. The noise was unmistakably coming from inside. It wasn't a scratch or a rodent. It sounded heavy, slow, and deliberate, dragging something across the metal floor. And interspersed with the dragging was that chilling sound of wet, sharp clicking, like teeth sharpening against concrete. I froze. The Yukon Code came back to me. Rule number 2, the one they never wrote down because it wasn't about mechanics or distance. It was about perception. Do not acknowledge what you hear. Not turn your head fully to face it. Assume the silence is a lie. If I opened that trailer door, I was dead. That much was certain.
But the thought that something was in my sealed cargo, riding with me, using my truck as its moving prison, was nearly enough to shatter my sanity. I turned back toward the cab, forcing myself to walk, not run. I avoided looking into the deeper shadows of the spruce line, focusing only on the glow of the residual heat radiating from the engine block. That's when I saw the tracks near the rear tires, disturbing the light powder of snow, were impressions that defied natural physics. They weren't paw prints, they were impossibly elongated footprints, narrow like a human's, but nearly 2 feet long, ending in 3 sharp, deep indentations that looked less like toes and more like talons forged of obsidian. The gait suggested a bipedal creature, but one that shuffled or loped with a terrible starved awkwardness, and they were heading away from the trees, directly toward the rear of my trailer. I looked up. The smell intensified, sickeningly close.
Leaking sound inside the cargo hold stopped abruptly. In its place, a new sound began, soft, whispering, and utterly perverse. It was the sound of a voice, a child's voice, maybe 5 or 6 years old, muttering a panicked prayer. Please, please, I want my mom. It sounded weak, muffled, as if the child was trapped in a heavy wool blanket. The sheer terror in the little voice was a scalpel to my emotional defenses. My fatherly instinct, buried under years of isolation and road fatigue, flared violently. I started running back towards the trailer door, flashlights shaking wildly. No. Wait. Rule 2. Manchuk's face, etched with the wisdom of the long dark, flashed in my mind. It hunts with sound. It will use the voices of your dead, the memory of your lost, the fear of your future. If you acknowledge the sound, you acknowledge its presence, and it will possess your thoughts. I slammed the heel of my palm against my temple, trying to clear the auditory hallucination.
Not real, not real, not real.
The key turned. The engine coughed once, twice, a grinding sound of metal struggling against sub-zero viscosity, and then, mercifully, roared to life. The vibration of the engine was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It drowned out the muffled cries from the cargo hold. I threw the shifter into drive and punched the accelerator, the tires spinning momentarily before catching the asphalt. I didn't look back. I didn't check the mirrors. I kept my gaze fixed forward, straight into the tunnel of my headlights, praying that the sheer speed would tear me away from the psychological leech riding my tail. As I sped down the black highway, hitting 80 miles per hour on the straight stretch, the interior of the cab filled with the sickening stench once more. That cold, bone-dry decay. And then I felt it. A subtle, nearly imperceptible shift in the handling of the truck, as if a great, impossible weight had just settled gently onto the rear bumper. The suspension groaned lightly.
I dared not look in the side mirror, following the code with a rigidity born of sheer panic, but I knew. I felt the pressure, the presence, riding silently just a few feet behind my head. It was no longer tapping or crying. It was just there, a passenger of immense, starving dread, patiently waiting for me to break Rule 3. I drove for another 30 minutes, that silent, crushing weight anchored to my rig. The scent remained, thick and oily, permeating the heater vents, a constant, foul reminder. When I finally reached a rise in the road and the suspension relaxed, feeling lighter as the creature finally abandoned its ride, I thought I was safe, but I wasn't. I happened to glance at the passenger side window, the one I had left slightly dirty with road spray, and there, etched cleanly into the grime, as if drawn by a long, scraping fingernail, was a single, stylized symbol.
It was a crude drawing of a human eye, staring forward, permanently fixed on me, mocking the fact that I had nearly broken the second rule. I drove on, the scent finally beginning to dissipate, but the sight of that etching, drawn by something that had been close enough to breathe on the glass, felt like a branding iron to my soul. It had been watching me the entire time, judging my fear, and laughing at the pathetic comfort of my truck cab. I gripped the wheel tighter, speeding into the dark, knowing that the confrontation was coming, and that the only thing separating me from the starved darkness of the Yukon night was the desperate hope that rule number 3 of the code was stronger than the beast's insatiable hunger. The next signpost was still 100 miles away, and the night was long. The eye etched on the glass was a promise. I was not alone, and it was getting ready to play its final hand. It wasn't the sound of the engine dying that brought on the final dread.
It was the absolute, immediate silence that followed. 1 second, the strained groan of the carburetor battling the minus 40-degree air. The next, nothing but the hiss of the pressurized fuel line cooling down and the ringing in my own ears, a high, thin note of pure isolation. I was 20 miles from the nearest semblance of human light, trapped in the unforgiving blackness of the north. The truck, my coffin, was now stationary. Rule number 2, shattered. Never stop moving. I could see my breath clouding and freezing on the interior plastic of the dashboard. The smell of cold metal and stale coffee was overwhelming, but beneath it, insidious and faint, came something else. The scent that didn't belong to the cab, or the forest, or the snow. It was wet earth mixed with something cloyingly sweet, like carrion left out too long in the humid summer. It somehow radiating bone-deep cold. My eyes strained against the thick blackness outside the windshield.
The high beams were weak, carving out 2 tunnels of useless yellow light into the woods. The snow-dusted pines stood like skeletal sentinels, impossibly close, their shadows stretching and merging into the darkness that felt not just empty, but heavy. Then the scraping started. It wasn't a sound of movement toward me, but over me. A dry, dragging noise, like ancient leather stretched over rough stone, or perhaps dried fingernails across the roof of the cabin. It started quietly, a tentative exploration, then grew more confident, shifting weight, moving from the rear of the trailer forward, metal protesting with a muffled screech under a pressure it was never meant to bear. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, sweat already chilling on my forehead beneath my wool cap. Every muscle in my body seized, trying to fight the primal, debilitating urge to look up, to peer through the tiny, fogged rear window and see what had finally got me.
This was a consequence of stopping, and I knew, with the cold clarity of imminent death, that this was why they said the rules were only a delay. Once you broke one, they all fell away. I hadn't stopped willingly, but the thing outside didn't care about mechanics. It only cared about the stillness. And then came the hunger. It was instantaneous and total, a searing, gnawing void that ripped through my gut and clawed at my throat. It was not the hunger of missed meals, but an acidic, desperate need for warmth, for sustenance, for anything fleshy and raw. It was agonizing, distracting, forcing my focus inward, away from the danger. Rule number 3, never acknowledge the hunger. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to drown out the internal roar of starvation. It felt foreign, a parasite taking root. I remembered the stories. The Wendigo doesn't just eat you. It implants its own madness, its own eternal craving, so that by the time you die, you understand why it is starving. The scraping above me paused. The scent of sweet decay intensified, now laced with an acrid metallic smell. Blood, perhaps, or just ozone. A sound then, right next to the driver's side door, so close it vibrated through the metal frame and into my hip. A whispering breath, impossibly dry, like sand slipping through a narrow crack. It was a rhythmic, calculated breathing, and I could feel the microscopic shift in air pressure, the faint puff of frigid air right outside the thin layer of glass. It was waiting. It wasn't trying to tear the door off yet. It was studying me, measuring the thickness of my resolve, letting the hunger inside me do its work. I pressed my face against the steering wheel, praying for the floor to swallow me.
I remembered the last story told by a grizzled old-timer named Silas about a logging crew that went missing near Eagle Plain. They found the truck still running, doors locked from the inside, but inside there was only a mess of shredded parkas and bloodless, gnawed clean bones. Silas never said what happened to the drivers, only that the seats looked like something had been using them to steady itself while performing a delicate surgical dissection. The sudden silence returned, even heavier than before. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but in that black box of dread,
It felt like hours. Had it gone? Was it a testing period? Did it realize I was ignoring its implanted hunger? I risked a millimeter of movement, shifting my gaze toward the side mirror. The reflection was distorted, but I could just make out the ridge of the truck's fender and the dark outline of the woods. And then I saw it. Not in the mirror, not in the trees.
It was in the narrow gap between the hood and the windshield, reflected in the subtle sheen of the dashboard plastic. A thin, horizontal line, impossibly high off the ground, that shouldn't have been there. It was bone white and sharp, then another, intersecting it at a jagged angle. It hadn't left. It had simply folded itself down, flattening its impossible structure, and was now crouched directly on the hood of the truck, completely invisible against the black paint, its immense weight pressing the suspension down with a sickening creak, and it was staring directly through the windshield. I broke rule number 1. I looked. My head snapped up, propelled by a force stronger than fear, driven by the absolute necessity of confirmation. It was an atrocity of nature. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, hunched and skeletal, covered in a ragged, frozen hide the color of wet ash and old snow.
Its limbs were elongated beyond reason. Thick ropes of muscle and tendon stretched over ivory bone, ending in talons that looked less like claws and more like shards of obsidian. But the face was what hollowed me out completely. It was less a face and more a skull wrapped tightly in brittle, stretched skin. Its eyes were immense, sunken voids, wet and dark, reflecting the faint green glow of my instrument panel. But it was the mouth that stole the air from the cab, a lipless, cavernous split in the lower jaw, filled with teeth that were long, uneven spikes, stained brown and black. And it was smiling, not a grin of victory, but a horrifying, wide, desperate rictus of pure, agonizing starvation. The smell of it, now that it was inches away, pressed against the glass, was pure decay concentrated. It was the stench of 1,000 years of winter and death, cold enough to burn my sinuses, thick enough to taste.
It raised one immense hand, talons scraping delicately on the thick safety glass, not trying to break it, but tracing patterns, as if writing its name. Then the creature spoke. It wasn't a roar or a guttural growl. It was a whisper that sounded like dry leaves being dragged across concrete, high-pitched and full of immense, heart-breaking suffering. Driver, I am so hungry. The sound wasn't external. It was in my head, bypassing my ears, settling deep into the part of my brain that registers pain and panic. It was the sound of its internal hunger, the same hunger it had infected me with. And in that moment, in a flash of terror so profound it felt like enlightenment, I understood the third rule completely. It didn't just want me to ignore the hunger. It wanted me to ignore its suffering, because acknowledging its endless need meant admitting that the cycle was real,
and that I was next. The creature's hand suddenly slammed down with catastrophic force.
The windshield spider-webbed instantly, shards of glass collapsing inward around the points of impact, but holding the structure. Then came the breach. The creature didn't smash the remaining glass, it simply reached through the weakest point, the side panel. I heard the sickening, grinding tear of metal as the driver's side door was peeled away from the chassis like a tin can. The sound was deafening, metallic shriek followed by the explosive rush of Arctic pear. The Wendigo's head dipped, too large to fit easily, and it began to worm its way into the confined space, its breath washing over me, the stench of its mouth an immediate paralyzing toxin. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the passenger door, fumbling blindly for the flare gun I kept under the seat. The creature's eyes, immense and black, locked onto mine.
Its skeletal fingers, long enough to span the entire width of the cab, closed around my shoulder, not tightly, but with a terrifying precision, like a butcher selecting the cut. I could feel the razor-sharp cold of its claws sinking through the parka, through the layers of skin and muscle, right to the bone. But it didn't pull. Instead, it brought its face closer, its breath hot and fetid, filling my vision. I could see the tiny, minute movements of whatever lived inside its starved, wet eyes. It wasn't trying to tear my flesh. It was forcing me to witness its hunger, to look into the void of its endless torment. It was waiting for me to scream, to panic, to offer myself up as a sacrifice to the shared, agonizing need for consumption. Then, a desperate, irrational survival instinct kicked in. I didn't reach for the flare gun. I reached for the one thing I had left, the engine keys, still dangling in the ignition.
With a superhuman surge of adrenaline, I shoved my hand past its ribcage, turning the key hard. The engine caught, not smoothly, but with a sudden, roaring defiance. The sound shocked the Wendigo. The loud mechanical scream of the dying diesel engine was an intrusion it hadn't anticipated. For a split second, its grip loosened, the immense darkness in its eyes flickering with momentary confusion. That was my window. I jammed my foot onto the accelerator. The truck, its driver's side now an open ruin, lurched forward, dragging the Wendigo with it. It roared, a sound that was pure agony and ancient rage, finally external, ripping the air. The creature released its grip, its talons scraping one last agonizing trail across my chest. I didn't steer. I drove straight into the trees, the metal frame groaning in protest, the windows shattering around me, branches whipping the cab, hoping the tight forest would scrape the monster off, or at least confuse its predatory instinct.
It kept the pedal floored, driving blind and reckless, listening to the sickening sounds of its body slamming against the trailer as it tried desperately to climb back on. Eventually, the weight vanished. The frantic scraping ceased. I drove for another 5 miles till the smell of exhaust and burnt pine finally replaced the wet decay. I stopped the truck only when the engine started overheating again. I staggered out into the snow, vomiting violently onto the fresh white blanket. I survived. I made it back to the outpost 3 days later, frostbitten and incoherent. They patched me up. They never asked about the massive claw marks that stretched from my shoulder to my hip, looking like 5 deep frozen trenches.
but the truck. I couldn't look at the truck. The inside of the cab was lined with the foul, sweet smell of its breath, a permanent stain on the metal.
Beyond the passenger seat, carefully placed amidst the chaos of blood and glass, was a single, impossibly long, dry piece of bone, snapped cleanly off one of its talons. I still have the bone. It sits in a locked box now, humming faintly with the code it carries. I found out later that my survival came with a caveat. I am always cold now, and the hunger, the unnatural, searing need for warm, raw meat never left. I eat only canned food, but every night when I look into the mirror, I swear I see the skin around my eyes pulling tighter, and my teeth look just a little bit longer than they used to. I follow the Yukon Code now, religiously, and sometimes when I'm driving alone on a long, dark stretch of road, I slow down. I don't stop, but I slow down, hoping that if I am moving just slowly enough, the creature out there, my predator, my co-starver, will think I'm still trying to adhere to the code. But sometimes I think about what it felt like when its claws sunk into me.
I think about the bone I keep locked away, and sometimes I wonder if the real purpose of the Yukon Code wasn't to save drivers, but simply to guide new ones into the long, dark, endless hunger of the North. Be careful what you look for when you drive these roads. Be careful what you stop for. Be careful what you let yourself crave, because the things that stalk the fringes of our maps don't just want your life. They want your soul, your mind, and your eternal companionship in the endless, unforgiving cold. If you made it this far, maybe you understand that the deepest darkness isn't out there. It's inside us, waiting for the cold to bring it out. Subscribe now, and let's see if we can distract ourselves from the growing hunger with more stories that remind us just how tenuous our grip on sanity really is. Until the next broadcast, keep your eyes on the road and keep your doors locked, always.